Now we're going to go over the facial bones and features, starting with the nasal bone. This is the nasal bone right over here. That's the nasal bone. The zygomatic bone is actually here. I'll show you from this aspect as well. From this view, this is the zygomatic bone, and right here is the nasal bone. Maxilla is over here. Do not confuse maxilla with mandible, because this is maxilla, but what I'm holding in my hand over here is the mandible. As I turn this skull upside down in relation to the mouth, the oral cavity, you have two process. You actually have two palatine bones. They will be situated over here. Now, with palatine bones being 2 in number, on top of that, in relation to above it, over here is the maxilla bone. So as you can see, this is the maxilla, and beneath that, you have the maxilla and the 2 palatine bones. Do be aware that these facial bones are all 2 in number. So just to go over again, 2 nasal bones, 2 zygomatic bones, 1 here and 1 here, 2 maxilla on top of here. Below that are the 2 palatine bones. So if if you have trouble memorizing this, you could just draw draw a square and think of the top 2 quadrants being the maxilla bones and the bottom 2 quadrants being the palatine bones. The palatine bones will always also have these notches over here, because this is not obviously the full it's obviously not showing the full scale, but this is towards the bottom and this is towards the top. So 2 palatine bones and 2 maxilla bones. You also have to identify the palatine process of the maxilla. The palatine process of the maxilla, if you were asked, will be in this area over here. The palatine process of the maxilla. Now, coming to the zygomatic bone. The zygomatic bone have arches. Now this zygomatic bone, these arches are in relation to the zygomatic process, which is over here. That's the zygomatic process. Zygomatic process. Also be aware that the zygomatic process is of the temporal bone, which is over here, from a lateral aspect of the skull. Even on this side, on the left side of the skull, the zygomatic process, it continues into the temporal bone. So just be aware that when we talk about the zygomatic process over here, it's also referred to as the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. Going over the parts of the mandible, I strongly encourage you to draw, if you can, just to know where everything is in relation to each other. I'm going to start off with the mandibular notch. Everyone knows what a notch is. This is the mandibular notch. As you go towards the edge, this is the condylar process of the mandible. The mandibular angle is over here. You can actually kind of tell that there's an angle. That's also known as the angle, the mandibular angle. Also, the ramus. This part over here, this entire part over here of the mandible is known as the ramus. The ramus of the mandible. And coming down to what this hole is, everyone knows that now anything that has a hole is referred to as a foramen. This is the mental foramen. So just to go over the structures again: mandibular notch, condylar process, ramus, the angle of the mandible, the mandibular notch, and the mental foramen. There's one on either side of the mandible. Also to be aware, this is the condylar process, but now as you go towards anterior, that is referred to as the coronoid process. So we have two processes to know that are on either side of the mandibular notch. To memorize this, what is more posterior is the condylar process, and what is more anterior towards the front is the coronoid process. Seeing from the left-hand side, coronoid process, condylar process. Coronoid process, condylar process. Even from this angle, we can go over here and show the angle of the mandible, the mandibular angle, the ramus of the mandible, the mandibular notch, and the mental foramen. Now coming to the hyoid bone. Now, there wasn't anything specific that we have to know for the hyoid bone other than where it's located, which is directly below the mandible. The mandible and hyoid bone are actually connected via the mylohyoid muscle. We don't have to know that for the exam, but that's just food for thought. The three parts of the hyoid bone, they include the body of the hyoid bone, the greater horn of the hyoid bone, and the lesser horn. Less will be towards below, and the hyoid bone and the greater horn will be more towards the top. So that's one way to actually know what's greater versus lesser. So again, for the hyoid bone, you have the body of the hyoid bone, then you have the lesser horn, which is this part right over here, and you have the greater horn of the hyoid bone.